Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on how we can help more Americans achieve stable income in retirement. My name is Letty Nocera, and I'm the Senior Manager of Funding Our Future, a cross-sector coalition of organizations dedicated to advancing policies that help more Americans become financially secure and live with dignity in retirement. As access to traditional pensions continues to decline, we must reevaluate the design of defined contribution retirement plans, such as 401ks. These plans generally serve Americans well when it comes to accumulating savings during their working years, but they often provide little guidance for structured drawdown in retirement. Today, we'll work to unpack this with an esteemed panel of experts. We will allow time for a Q&A at the conclusion of the conversation, and questions should be submitted using the live chat function on YouTube and via Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. Before we get started, I would like to thank our coalition partners, and especially our elite partner, the Charles Schwab Foundation, for making this event possible. At this time, I would like to introduce Jeff Brown, Dean of the Gies College of Business at the University of Illinois, to present his recent research on trends in retirement income. Jeff, over to you.
Well, thanks, Letty, and good afternoon, everyone. So I always like to begin with a simple question, which is, why do we save for retirement? And I know this seems like a really easy question, but I want you to really think about it. Like, why are you saving for retirement? And I suspect the answer to that question has something to do with wanting to maintain your living standard even after you leave the workforce. And I also suspect that what your answer is not is something along the lines of, well, I want to have $1 million in my account at age 65. And the reason is that because wealth accumulation is really just the first step in the thing that we really, really care about, which is being able to provide for your spending needs for the rest of your life. Now, that's hard to do. Because people don't know how long they're going to live, and there are a lot of risks that they face in their retirement years. And as Letty pointed out, we've traditionally had Social Security and defined benefit plans that provided income as an annuity, and an annuity does solve this problem. It provides income for the rest of one's life. But today, we have a retirement system in the United States that is largely focused, I would say even obsessed, with wealth accumulation as a goal in and of itself. I could give lots of examples of this, but a few of them that come to mind is that most of our 401k plans don't offer annuities. We actually have rules in place that put a higher fiduciary burden on plan sponsors if they offer an annuity than if they don't. We have minimum distribution rules that encourage people to pull their money out quickly rather than thinking about how to make it last for life. Now, the economics literature that I and many others have contributed to, and it actually dates back more than six decades, has made it clear that lifetime income or annuity type products are really the most efficient way to ensure longevity risk, to ensure that people won't run out of money. And yet most people don't do it voluntarily. And over the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of research coming out showing that this lack of interest in annuitization is not the result of optimizing rational behavior on the part of individuals, but rather it's the result of a whole variety of behavioral and institutional factors that biased against it. So in some prior research that I had with Ari Kaptein and Arizo Letmer and Olivia Mitchell, as one example, we find that people find the annuitization decision just incredibly complicated. And as a result, they make a lot of relatively simple mistakes in how they value the annuity. The magnitude of those valuation errors is negatively correlated with their level of financial sophistication. So the very people that probably need the annuity most are actually in the worst position to be able to value it. So we have this interesting situation in which many of us believe that people would be better off having more lifetime income. Our system, however, is not designed to support it, and people aren't choosing to do it on their own. Now, we've seen this kind of problem before with savings rates and diversification and so forth, and we've leveraged default options like automatic enrollment, automatic diversification through QDIAs, ideas that are now largely viewed as best practice in industry. And some have called for extending this logic to the payout phase through some kind of automatic annuitization. There's two main points I want to make today, and one of them is going to draw upon this recent research that we have. But the first point I want to make is that designing a default option is actually really hard when it comes to doing it for payouts. And the reason it's hard is that unlike things like diversification, our models on the payout decision, frankly, they just don't provide very useful bounds on how much annuitization people ought to have. It's easy to write down a model that seems to make a lot of sense in which people want to annuitize everything, and you can take the same model and change some of the parameters and say they don't want to annuitize anything. And so there's so much heterogeneity in the population that it's hard to find a single answer that's really right for everybody, maybe not even a majority of people, and that makes it tough. It's also politically difficult to sustain an annuity option. We saw this in the United Kingdom, where they had an annuity, a mandatory annuitization, and unraveled over time. And part of the reason is that, you know, the value that comes from an annuity in terms of the higher income is the result of being willing to give up the right to that money if you die early. And so if you mandate or automatically enroll people into an annuity, and then you end up in a situation where somebody just got rolled into an irreversible product, and then they find out that they have stage 4 cancer, that's going to be something that's eventually going to unravel. When that starts to happen, then the value that the annuity can provide or the lifetime income can provide is diminished. But the second point I want to make, though, is this sometimes leads people to think we shouldn't have a default payout option at all. And the point of the research I want to talk a little bit about today is that we sort of already have a default. Unfortunately, it's a default that was not designed with retirement income in mind. It was designed with wanting to tax the revenue, to gain the revenue from taxing the accumulations in mind. And what do I mean by this? So if we can put up the first graph, I have recent research with Jim Viterbo of MIT and Dave Richardson at the TIAA Institute. We look at nearly 2 decades of data on the complete universe of TIAA GREF participants to understand their choice of how to take a payout at the time that they retire. And what you see, well, first of all, one of the key findings is that the participants are working longer over the sample. And then when you add on to that the fact that people sometimes wait a couple of years to make their first payout decision after they retire, what we end up with is more and more people who are just reaching age 70 and a half, having not made a distribution decision yet. And so they're just being defaulted into the required minimum distribution rule rather than choosing an option alternatively. So this graph that you see here, what you see is the blue line shows any form of life contingent product, a single life annuity, a joint life annuity, could be with or without guarantee periods. What we see is over about a 2-decade period, the fraction taking their first income in the form of some kind of guaranteed lifetime income fell from over 60% to under 20% in less than 20 years. The orange line shows the fraction of people taking their first income draw in the form of basically just taking the required minimum distribution payout. And over that same 2 decades, the fraction taking the RMD climbed from just about 10% to over 50%. Now, there are other options here, which is why the graph doesn't add to 100. But the key point of this is that annuitization is declining and reliance upon the RMD is increasing. Now, you may look at that and think, well, the RMDs are not bad. And so maybe that's not a bad default option to have. But if we could flip to the second slide, I'll just say that I had written a policy brief about 15 years ago that just was comparing the payout from different ways, you know, a real annuity, an inflation indexed annuity, the RMD rule, the particular one that was 1 over life expectancy and so forth. And the basic point of that, under almost any assumption, is that because of the mortality premium that comes along with guaranteed lifetime income, there's really no other way to beat what an annuity does for you. And the RMD rules in particular are not, I think, a good guide to how people ought to be taking their money out in retirement. If you follow that 1 over life expectancy rule, for example, which is sort of the tannish line, that's the smoothest curve there, you see that if somebody lives into their 90s, they're not going to have very much income each month. And again, it shouldn't be surprising that this is not a great default payout option, because it wasn't designed with retirement income security in mind. It was really designed through the lens of tax policy. So we can take the slide away. We're really in a situation in which people left to their own devices are not making great decisions about how to withdraw income. There's enormous heterogeneity in what the right decision is, and that makes it difficult to design the default. And so by accident, we've created a default that is not particularly good, but is playing an ever greater role. We have a really great discussion to get to, and so I just want to take a minute to sum up this idea of how we should think about this RMD versus annuity versus other approaches to the default, which is, I'm not here today to say that we know exactly what the right default option ought to be. My point is that we need to be intentional about it rather than letting the RMD sort of de facto become a default for us. And I would simply say that I think there's a few characteristics of what would make a good default option in the payout phase. One is, again, do it intentionally with retirement security in mind. Second, we have, although ideally I would love to have some kind of a default where everyone would have enough lifetime income to cover their basic expenses. The issue is there's so much heterogeneity in circumstances and individual preferences that it's hard to do that in, say, a 401k plan. So any default's going to have a lot more flexibility to it than we see in other contexts. And then finally, I would just say that given the many institutional and behavioral biases that are currently sort of stacked against taking lifetime income, I think if anything, we ought to err a little bit on the side of doing more to promote lifetime income. I happen to be a fan of including annuitization, annuity type or guaranteed income products as a sleeve in QDIA default investment options. I like it because it helps with the framing issue that I didn't really talk about, but we have some research on. It annuitizes gradually, it does so only partially, and so forth. There may be other options as well, and I hope some of our discussion today is able to get to some of that. So much more I'd love to say, but I want to turn it over to Jason, who's going to lead a really outstanding panel to discuss some of these options in more detail.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. Really interesting research, and you make a good point about intentionality. Note for the audience that Jeff is going to kindly stick around for our next portion of the afternoon, which is our panel discussion. And as a reminder, if you have questions during the conversation, please enter them in the chat or submit them on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive, and we'll have our guests answer them toward the end of the program. I am pleased to now introduce our panelists for today's conversation. We have joining us Anna Maria Lusardi, who's a senior fellow with the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, also director of the Financial Freedom Initiative. Anna Maria is also a professor of finance and stresses the importance of financial literacy as an essential skill to thrive in today's society. Next, we have Ken Mungen joining us, who is the chairman of Milliman. And upon joining the organization in 1998, he has made it his mission to empower clients to protect the health and financial well-being of all people. And finally, we have joining us Nick Nafusi, the managing director at BlackRock, who also leads LifePath, which is BlackRock's global target date fund franchise, which helps millions of people around the world save and invest for retirement. Moderating this discussion is Jason Fichtner, Chief Economist at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Letty. Appreciate it. And Jeff, thank you for the presentation. And we'll definitely come back to you. And I will tell the audience, I will promise you we will come back and answer all the acronyms. So Jeff, be ready to tell everybody what a QDIA is and why it's important, especially after Secure Act and Secure Act 2.0. That'll come from the questions. I want to start off with a general framing because this topic is lifetime income and how we can have improved strategies for retirement. And so it's probably important to start off after Jeff's presentation. We'll talk about why this is important today. Why are we talking now so much about the importance and need for lifetime income? And Ken, I want to start with you on that, please.
Happy to. The key point is the retirement security problem, as Jeff outlined it. It applies to everyone. Everyone has got a simple problem to solve. How do I purchase essential goods and services every month by month, for as long as I live? And as pensions have faded into the rearview mirror, this problem is simply unsolved for people. And the reality is we are relying on the 401k system to be the primary retirement security tool. And it does not address the fact that longevity risk is just as big a risk as market risk as people go through retirement. So this problem simply must be solved, and the pressure is just ever increasing until we actually get on board and solve it.
Nick?
Thanks, Jason. First of all, I love the opening from the way that Jeff framed this. I think it's outstanding. I think the way that I would look at the problem is the shift has happened. We've got this massive demographic shift that has gone on. And I think now it is becoming much more of an acute problem. So as we look to how do we change this, or how do we evolve the solutions, what I think we're really trying to find are what are the ways that we can automate this into the existing products that work. And there's a phrase that Jeff used about using a lot of these auto features, and these auto features were put in 2006 into a lot of 401k plans through the Pension Protection Act. The way that we would like to think about this is how can we help people auto retire? So we auto escalate, we auto annuitize, or sorry, we auto escalate, we auto enroll people, but now how can we auto retire?
Great, thanks. Anna, your thoughts?
Yes, so more than ever, we need to have financial security, guarantee financial security. And as Jeff has really rightly indicated, we know and spend a lot of time in understanding how to accumulate, and we have spent so much less time understanding how to decumulate after retirement. And this is, of course, equally important. But what we also have seen, and Jeff emphasized, this is also very complex. And the complexity, in fact, in the accumulation, I think, are harder than the accumulation. And that's why I think we need to turn our attention to this. And we need at this point perhaps to develop also products that can perhaps satisfy a very heterogeneous population, where perhaps the one size doesn't fit all, where we might need to provide more tool and more help to people to really understand what to do, because what's at stake is really the financial security and our capacity to live a good life for a long time.
So I think one of the things that's important to point out, and Jeff, I'll ask you to comment on this too, but what we're seeing is you've all kind of mentioned this demographic shift, right? You've mentioned it, Ken mentioned it, Anna and Nick got to it as well. We are going from a time where, one, defined benefit plans were sort of the norm. It's not like everybody had them, they didn't, but they were sort of seen as the norm. But defined benefit plans that gave you a paycheck when you retired. So basically you had a paycheck when you worked, and a paycheck for life is no longer there. They were financially unstable. They made promises they couldn't keep. And we moved into this defined contribution landscape now, where people are saving for their retirement, but they don't have any direction of what to do with that when they retire. They don't know how to make sure that asset lasts them the rest of their life as an income problem, retirement income problem. We're going from 10,000 people a day to our peak 65 moment, which will be in 2024 next year, where about 12,000 people a day will start turning 65. It's a big demographic challenge for us, and we sort of got to get around this hump about how to solve it. So that the time really is now for us to do this work. And so while the work you guys are doing on this is very much appreciated and very relevant, but as we start talking about how to make income and retirement more feasible, and sort of the idea is, income is now the outcome in retirement. Some people are doing this today. Jeff, you mentioned they're doing it through RMDs, but it wasn't designed to be an income strategy. It's a tax strategy to basically tax the deferred income that people have when they were saving in their 401k plans. So besides RMDs, how are people today drawing down their assets as income? Are they just doing it willy-nilly? Is there a plan for it? Anna, what do you think they're doing from a financial literacy standpoint?
Yes, we have actually data on this, and I'm very also grateful of some of your support in looking at this research. I think we see an indication of some heterogeneity, which I think is worrisome. First of all, we see people, for example, not planning for retirement or not planning for retirement until they are close to it, which might not give them a lot of years to do so. We also see two other trends, which I think are important. We see people carrying debt into retirement. And this is also important because some of your assets might actually serve to service debt. And that might be another reason for this lack of annuitization. And in some of our research actually shows that this is the case. We also see that people have, and many of them, close to retirement and into retirement, perhaps they have too much illiquid asset, including perhaps the house or some of their retirement asset, where we see them suffering from lack of liquidity. And that can also be a potential problem. So we have identified actually three issues when we look at trying to explain a little bit some of this lack of annuitization, which is the debt, the lack of liquidity, and also the financial literacy. What we see is that people have very, very basic knowledge, and in particular, the knowledge they lack the most is risk literacy. which is knowledge related to risk. And this is why I think that any initiative, even though we might want to help people annuities, give them a nudge and so on, we also need to accompany that with some more financial knowledge so that people can use instrument better and for their own financial security.
Nick, I want to turn to you in the same question because you're, again, you and Ken are in the industry, so I'll go to Ken next, but you first, Nick. How are you seeing people today? Because you run a program that's trying to help people get lifetime income. What are they doing today to sort of get the income they need in retirement, or how are they planning or not planning? How are they doing this?
Sure. And when we think about target date funds, we think about this as a mass market product. So a lot of times we're not engaging directly with like a financial advisor around the target date funds. We did some research a couple of years ago, which what basically found was that people will spend their Social Security income when they're in retirement. They'll spend their capital gains, if they have any capital gains, and then any income generated from the portfolios. What they don't do is actually spend down the assets. If they've got a large enough asset base, they tend to hold on to those assets and not spend them. That was the first observation we had. The second one is they tend to take a lot more risk than we would recommend. So even though they don't spend down their assets, they're in portfolios closer to about a 60-40 or a 65-35 portfolio, where we would say it's somewhere between a 40% equity to 50% equity portfolio. So we find them oddly taking more risk, but then also not spending their money down appropriately, which is a bit of an odd conundrum as we look at it.
It's interesting because one of the things, and I'm going to go to Ken next, but I'm going to put you on notice, Jeff, that I'm coming to you about the 4% rule, because people sort of, the financial advisors tell people, well, you can spend down 4% of your assets per year. Nick, you're mentioning that people aren't touching their assets. And I think part of that is they're just afraid of reaching into those assets because they're afraid to spend it and that they might run out of money. So Ken, what are you seeing going on in the industry that people are, how are they spending their assets in retirement? Are they not? Are they leaving their assets untouched and not spending enough?
So you hit the nail right on the head, Jason. If you do a cluster analysis, you see that people fall into different clusters. As Nick pointed out, their investment is basically a balanced fund, and then they're taking withdrawals to purchase the essential goods and services that they need every month, but they have no idea how to solve the risk management problem because it's
Did I lose Ken? Or did I lose me?
You lost Ken.
I lost
I'm happy
Ken.
You want me to go ahead and
talk Jeff, why don't you until we get Ken back?
To come back?
Please.
So I assume you wanted to know what I thought of the 4% rule. I'm not a big fan for two reasons. One is any rule like that is totally arbitrary and doesn't reflect market conditions. So a 4% rule is a very different rule if we have long-term treasuries at 1% versus long-term treasuries at 5 or 6% in terms of the impact on the sustainability of the income that can provide. So that's reason one. But reason number two is that it really subjects one to a lower level of sustainable lifetime income than they could have under many alternative approaches. I mean, if we took, a single premium immediate annuity, you get way more than 4% as income each year, and it's guaranteed to last for as long as you do. Now, of course, you may not be able to, if you put everything into an immediate annuity, you wouldn't have anything left to bequeath. But no one says you have to put your entire wealth into it. I just think the 4% rule is completely arbitrary, and is just frankly not a good guide for most people.
And I think it's important to note too, when you say the 4% rule, there's been a rule of thumb that people go to these heuristics, these financial heuristics, that if you spend 4% of your assets per year, that'll last you the rest of your life in retirement. But of course, if you were to retire in 2007, right before the 2008 crash, your 401k would have been a 201k, and then you're living on half the income. You outlive your savings. So this challenge of trying to make sure we have enough assets for people and income in retirement is very important. And Ken, you're back with us, so I'm going to turn back to you.
I just wanted to add, yes. Not only did you lose half your 401k in 2008, but then if you invested in risk-free assets for the next decade, you were getting, incredibly low returns. So even the 4% rule wasn't going to be sustainable in that world.
Right. Yeah. And Jeff just pointed out that the sequence of returns problem is a nasty risk management problem to solve. If the markets fall and you're depleting your portfolio rapidly, then even if the market comes back, your portfolio does not come back. And also, when people see that happen, they experience anxiety. And so then they panic and then they move into risk-free assets. Also, there's the issue of vitality. We talked about how people fall into clusters in terms of how they spend their money, but while they're doing that, they're also aging. And as people get into very advanced age, they're going to experience cognitive and physical decline. So whatever decisions they're making in the early retirement, they're not going to be able to make as good decisions dealing with the complexities as they get older. So it's just such a tough problem for people to expect people to have to solve this on their own. That is simply unrealistic. And that's why I'm hoping that employers can step in and help them.
That's good. Nick, do you want to add on to that? And then I'm going to ask Anna a question.
Sure, I'll be brief. I think I'm in agreement with what's been stated so far. What I will say that we did at BlackRock is we created something called the LifePath Spending Tool. You can go online and look this up. It's very simple. If you just go to Google and type in LifePath Spending Tool, it'll take you to our public website. There's no paywall or anything like that to get through it. But what we do is we want to move people away from this heuristic of the 4% rule. What we look at is we look at really two factors. We look at long-term capital market assumptions, and then we look at mortality tables. So we need to adjust everybody's payout based on how old they are. A 62-year-old has a different payout than a 70-year-old based on their mortality table. And the idea with a simple tool, we only ask you how much money do you have and then your age. It allows people to have a better understanding of what they can spend and then hopefully begin the education process from there.
I mean, this is interesting too, because there's other research, and you guys have kind of hit on this a little bit before I turn to you, Anna, about people's, like, they're fearful, right? They basically have been told to save their entire life. They get to retirement, they're kind of let on their own. They're not sure how to manage that money. They're not sure how much they can draw down safely and so that it lasts a lifetime. And we do find that people then don't touch those assets. And Nick, you mentioned that too. They just leave them there, so they're not spending enough. Research by David Blanchett, who's at PGIM, has called this the license to spend. If you have more protected income, you basically spend up to what economists call a budget constraint. We're used to getting a salary, a paycheck when we're at work. We know what we get every month or every 2 weeks. We spend up to that, and we save some. That's our budget constraint. In retirement, we don't get that paycheck for life if you don't have an annuity or some protected income outside of Social Security. You don't have a pension plan anymore. So people don't spend enough. So the idea is what we're trying to solve here is to make sure people have adequate, sufficient spending in retirement. And part of that also goes to the idea of longevity. You mentioned sequence of return risk, there's market risk, there's inflation risk. Anna, you've done a lot of work on longevity sort of literacy. And before I turn to you on some of your research you've done, I remember when I was at the Social Security Administration, I would walk into field offices and ask questions. Because people would be getting retirement, they'd sign up for Social Security at age 62. A lot of them didn't understand it was a reduced benefit amount that lasts the rest of their life. But they also didn't understand the longevity. If I would talk to them and they're 62 and I'd say, how long do you think you're going to live? They'd say, 84 till I'm 84. And I'd say, oh, you have then enough retirement income to last you 22 years. They'd say, no, I didn't. They'd pause. Somehow thinking you're 62 living to 84 did not in their mind equal needing 22 years of savings. So Anna, maybe with your research, you can talk about how longevity literacy is kind of low and what that means then for people's ability to plan for retirement.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeff. So we had, in a sense, the same experience, and we decided to take this to the data. And in the past 2 years, we have asked questions about longevity in our TIA Institute GFLAG Personal Finance Index data. This is data we collect each year in January, first to assess the knowledge of personal finance in the population and see if there are improvements. But each year we also add new questions. And in 2022 and 2023, we had asked these questions about longevity. In fact, 3 questions. And we have asked the simple question that you had mentioned, Jason. So we have asked if people know, and we didn't ask about their own longevity, but on average, how a 65 years old, would live, how many years he would live, depending if it is a man or a woman. And then we ask what's the probability that somebody would live past 90, and also what's the odd that one would make it to 70, right? So we are asking people to make all of this plan for retirement, but do they even have this basic knowledge of what is their planning horizon? And unfortunately, the findings are that, in fact, only 1/3 of the population have this, at least average or correct knowledge of their planning horizon. And yet again, here we see big differences. And I have to say, we see big differences between men and women, where this time men tend to underestimate how long they will live after 65. And yet again, this can be another explanation why people are not making adequate preparation for their retirement. And this can matter and can matter a big deal. And this is why I have to say, while I am a fan of helping people and having all of these automatic methods, we also, need to make sure that people understand what they are doing, helping them, give them some tools as well, because you cannot expect people to automate everything. And then when they get to retirement, in fact, they have not even an idea of what to do with their wealth. I think it's important now that we have changed the pension system to make sure that people have the tools and knowledge to make adequate financial decision, because there is so much at stake.
Thank you. One of the things that's, I think also interesting, and, and Ken, I'm going to go to you next, then follow up with Jeff, but, as economists love annuities. We think they're fantastic, right? They basically solve several problems, but if you ask real people, they don't like them at all. So what's going on here? Why the differentiation?
So starting with me?
Yeah, please.
I think that the typical person doesn't really understand anything about annuities. When they do encounter them, it's for people who have accumulated significant wealth, and then they sit down with a financial advisor and they're building a comprehensive financial management plan, financial plan, and annuities become part of their portfolio. The vast majority of people where, their 401k is their primary retirement savings, they probably don't know anything about annuities. Also, for an employer-based system, the potential is for insurance companies to offer very simple annuities that just pay a fixed monthly income for life, starting at a certain age, and then to strip out all the bells and whistles and also all the distribution costs. Because most people, if they do encounter annuities, it's in a retail distribution model where those distribution costs are one of the costs of manufacturing the product. So you make the product simpler, it becomes cheaper, and then its value in solving the retirement income problem becomes incredibly compelling.
So Jeff, I want to ask you to chime in here, because you've done a lot of research on the behavioral economics and also framing, because this is one of those things where if you go out and talk to people, and again, I try to make sure people aren't, there's economists and real people. So we always joke about being an economist and the dismal science. But if you go out and ask people, would you like to make sure that your income lasts your lifetime, your retirement income lasts for a lifetime, your assets? They say yes. If you say, would you like to have a paycheck for life? They say yes. If you ask them, would you like to have a personal pension? They say yes. If you ask them, do you want to have an annuity? They say no. So what's going on with our framing problem?
Yeah, so look, this is a market that has been experienced death by 1,000 cuts. There's no one single piece. It's a really complex decision. It combines uncertainty with, long time horizons. The products, we've made them hard to understand because there's too many different things that have the name annuity in them, and some of them have nothing to do with lifetime income. The fact that they're irreversible in many cases, there's a lot happening. But what you're referring to is the work we've done on framing, which basically we asked people to compare various financial products, a simple savings account, a single premium immediate annuity, and other products as well. And an intervention that was as trivial and as simple as just changing a few words, presenting all the same information. But in one case, if we get them to think about it in terms of wealth, which is what our system conditions people to think about, then they view an annuity as risky. They're like, I have this wealth, you're asking me to hand it over to you, and then how much of that wealth I get back depends on how long I live. That feels like a roulette wheel where the number is how many years you're going to live. They don't like it. But if you take the exact same information and you portray it to them just using subtle changes in wording, and you talk about income and spending and so forth, then they love it. And it literally, it's half the population flips. It goes from only about 20% of people liking the annuity to like 70% of them liking the annuity. So this gets at the issue of one of the sort of meta problems that we have is that with everything designed around wealth accumulation, we have conditioned an entire generation to define success in terms of how much money they have in their retirement account at a given point in time. And that's a completely useless statistic for them thinking about how much income they're going to have each month in retirement. That's why I was a big fan of the lifetime income disclosure. But it's also why I think we need to build income into some of our products, like these qualified default investments that are able to be used as default investment options and plans. I think there's a lot going on here, but I think the meta problem is that we just haven't educated and conditioned people in the right way.
Nick, I want to come back to you, because one of the things we got a question in the chat that isn't the key here helping people build a realistic budget for retirement before they get there, and then creating income to fund that budget. And some of the things you're doing at BlackRock and stories help with that. So how are you doing that with LifePath? And I think there's also a distinction we should probably make, is Jeff mentioned, I think twice now, the irrevocability of annuities, but there's guaranteed and non-guaranteed sources of income you can have in retirement. So it might be worth talking about that as well.
Okay, great question. Super complex though. So as far as if we could get people to do a budget before retirement, I would be shocked. So I think one of the problems that we have is people don't budget, and I think you used this earlier, Jason, where there's just a budget constraint, and that tends to be our paycheck. That tends to be how people budget, and they look to see if they've gone over or under in their bank account on any given month. So the idea that people are going to build up a budget, yes, we would love that. We have more tools to help people budget than I think we know what to do with. Where I think people struggle though is they just don't know how to get income, because we've not really convinced people how to spend their money. We've helped them save their money for 30 or 40 years, but we haven't taught them how to spend their money. So the idea that we would have with building in some sort of a guaranteed product into an otherwise diversified portfolio helps alleviate some of that risk and help them have this smoothing over time. So we think the problem in retirement is different than just wealth maximization, obviously, during your working years. And this is what we would like to see come into the markets more. Our view is we want to maximize the amount that somebody can spend. We want to minimize their variability of spending, and then we want to address longevity. There's not one product that serves all of those things. So we've got to be able to build a portfolio of products just like they do during accumulation. So the way that we have thought about this, it's how do you make insurance part of the asset allocation decision and not two separate decisions? I think this is one of the problems of confusion, is that an insurance product is oftentimes a transaction that you have either with your financial advisor or with a person that's not your financial advisor. So now you've increased the amount of relationships that you're dealing with. So by incorporating the insurance product into the otherwise asset allocation product, it's a more diverse portfolio. And I think that what you end up with is a better outcome, because that's where you can start leaning into things like tools and narratives around spending in retirement.
So Ken, I want to turn back to you, because you've done a lot of work on this. And one of the things that Jeff mentioned, everyone sort of talked about, is we've been sort of pretty successful using defaults in the defined contribution in the savings space, like auto escalation, auto enrollment are very important tools. Jeff mentioned the idea of, he's not necessarily opposed to defaults in retirement for decumulation, but they're not necessarily one size fits all. But one option is to have a annuity or protected income strategy in a target date fund or in a DC plan. How could we do that and address some of the concerns that Jeff might have about a default? Right.
I think two things are vital. We need a default retirement income solution in every employer-sponsored plan in the country. And as employers select their default option, it's got to address Jeff's concern. And if it doesn't, then it won't work. And so when you look at the behavioral issues that come up, people are very uncomfortable with a large, irrevocable transaction. So for any default option that's on the menu, as the employer is working through with its advisors to figure out what their choice is going to be, have it be small and repeated over time. So for example, Nick talked about it being part of the asset allocation. An annuity would gradually build up in a person's portfolio as they're approaching the last dozen years or so going into retirement. So small, gradual. And then also the real benefit from an annuity is that you get the pooling of longevity, in particular as people get to advanced age. So you can make annuities where it's not an irrevocable decision before retirement. So for example, have it where if you change your mind and you're into that default option, you're still a few years from retirement, you can just leave it and transfer your money to something else, just like you would do if you were moving from a bond mutual fund to a stock mutual fund. So I think that's the key thing. But each employer should go through a few different possible default strategies and then make a choice. And then the employees would be automatically put into that. But if they didn't like that, they could then work through some and perhaps select one of the other choices, but only as a last resort, do what people are doing today, which is nothing, which is having no, real effective risk management solution.
Anna, you've done a lot of work, again, the financial literacy and risk comprehension. Do you think defaults have to be part of a strategy going forward when thinking about retirement income?
As I said, I think defaults are very helpful, but I think we need not a one-size-fits-all, and I think we need to complement the default with a good level of financial knowledge. Otherwise, I think by themselves, they might not help people very much. And I agree that I think it's helpful to start this process and to start thinking about the accumulation earlier in the life cycle and not just at the accumulation phase. But I really think in particular, considering just how little people understand risk, and therefore the other problem that might come up, as you perhaps give them even this more complex product, I think, this can be quite complicated. So my advocacy is really to try to look a little bit more at a more holistic approach to personal finance and not just for example, pension per se, and consider the many decisions that people have to make, because I think they are going to play a role. So I think, in my view, one of the reasons why people don't annuitize is also they are very concerned about health risk, their own risk, and also the risk of their now parents, their living parents, and so on. And so some risk literacy and risk knowledge is particularly important. And I think helping people make these decisions, with also an investment in knowledge, is as important as this automatic enrollment. In my view, automatic enrollment is not going to be the only solution, the perfect solution. And in fact, I don't even think it's going to work.
Jeff, what would you add to that?
Well, so you're right that I'm not opposed to defaults. I just think they're hard to figure out in this case. And in particular, I think it's important to note that we kind of already have a default. If it's not the RMD, it's just whatever the default from the plan is, which might just be a cash lump sum or just leave the money in and people have to figure it out on their own. We've designed the system that has put a huge complicated burden on individuals who are not well equipped for the most part to handle it. And so they definitely need guidance. And if that guidance is in the form of a recommendation rather than a default, a forced choice that walks them through a path that helps them understand the trade-offs, great. But we can't just leave them on their own. I also just want to say I completely agree with what Ken said, which is a small amount of annuitization done gradually and framed in an income context, I think, is a great way to go. And so having people put aside part of their accumulation in future income units from the time they're young is a great way to get around a lot of these barriers for part of their portfolio. So again, I'm in favor of doing something. It's really tough to get it right.
So let me add this. I think it's important to make two points to everything you're saying on this when it comes to default. So one, you should always have an opt-out, right? So when we say default, it doesn't mean we're putting you in this and you have no ability to say no to it. So one is, again, that's the choice architecture, to your point, Jeff. It's like, do you make them have an active choice, or do you say, we've got 3 different choices, we're putting you in one. Do you want to be in something else or nothing altogether? But you have to make a choice. You can't do nothing is one way of doing this. The other is thinking about this one. You mentioned the idea of surrenders. Like, you have to surrender a lot of money up front, and then some people don't feel comfortable if they die and the spouse isn't getting enough or something comes through. And Ken makes a very interesting point, which you sort of seconded, the idea of, like, you buy annuities along the way, right? And basically, and one of the things I think is important is people behaviorally have a hard time giving up so much money up front, but they get used to seeing something. And one of the things we could start talking about, and Ken mentioned this too, people start getting a quarterly statement when they start working and invest in a 401k or a 403b plan. They get a pie chart in their statement that shows how much is in equities, how much is in bonds, how much is international. A part of that could be a sliver that shows how much is in retirement income or protected income or an income sleeve, something. And that each year that pie slice starts to grow. So when they get to retirement, you don't ask them to annuitize. They're basically expecting to get this much income in retirement on top of Social Security, and that kind of helps with the framing. So I think this is where the reason we have you guys on here is your research work, both in the industry and academic, all fits well together about how we might be able to solve some of these problems of getting better retirement income when we pull all of it together and start thinking this through. And that's why it's important. I think some of the time I want to go next to is I want to talk about Social Security a little bit, because Social Security is one of our most important inflation-protected annuities we have out there. That's what Social Security is, right? It's a pooled investment. It's longevity risk. It's got inflation protection. It is an annuity. But for some people, they don't understand the benefit structure. So the Social Security Administration talks about age 62 as the early eligibility age. And I've been trying to change that for the last 15 years. And Jeff, you've done research on this too, which people they hear early eligibility and think they don't want to be late for getting their government benefits. Who wants to be late for a movie or to a buffet for dinner or getting their government benefits? They don't realize that getting benefits at age 62 means you're probably getting a 30% reduction for the rest of your life. And we're trying to change that. And so there's a bipartisan bill in the Senate that's introduced that would change the nomenclature and not talk about early eligibility age. It'd be the minimum benefit age. And age 67 would no longer be the full or normal retirement age. It'd be standard. And then age 70 would be another maximum benefit age. And so it would start a conversation. People would ask, what do you mean by minimum and maximum? I can get a different amount? And that could be helpful. And we start thinking then about default strategies. One could be if someone wants to retire or thinks they want to retire or has to retire at age 62, and they want to claim Social Security, what about some default option, Jeff, that would allow them to get some partial annuitization of their DC assets? That would give them an age 62 retirement benefit of Social Security, but it's from their DC plan. So they get a 5-year fixed annuity that basically gives them simulating their age 62 benefit to allow them to facilitate delaying claiming to age 67 or 70, take advantage then of a higher Social Security benefit that would then last the rest of their life. So I think these are some of the challenges we need to think through and how we can use the current system we have and improve upon the one that we're building.
Yeah, so look, delaying Social Security claiming is the best financial decision that almost any normal retiree could make, and yet almost no one does it. And for all the reasons you suggested. And so I do think that thinking through this holistic approach of how to integrate payouts from a 401k with the Social Security claiming decision, while complicated, is absolutely worth thinking about. I would even go a step further in the bill that you suggested, which is there's nothing normal or full about the full retirement age. The only two ages that really matter are what's the earliest and what are the latest you can get it. And I would probably do some research to go even further to encourage people to do it later, to make it clear that when you claim at 62, you're giving up a lot. But, you know, I understand people have liquidity needs. And so your idea of allowing them to kind of have their 401k provide payments to get them over that hump until they claim a bit later, I think is a great idea if we could figure out how to implement it. Yeah,
I've been calling it a bridge annuity, something to bridge you to delay and facilitate delaying Social Security claiming. And it's important to note, one, you know, the difference is huge, as you said, Jeff. I mean, the difference between an age 62 monthly benefit and age 70 is about 74%. That's a huge increase in monthly income just by delaying if you can. I want to remind folks, I want to remind folks to put, if they have questions, put them in the chat for the panelists. We have about 10 minutes left. Sorry, Jeff.
No, I was just going to say, of course, one of the challenges that we have there, and that there's research to support this, is that people concerned about the solvency or the fiscal sustainability of Social Security are going to be less willing to take that deal. So it would obviously be helpful if Congress would also act to shore up Social Security sooner rather than later in whatever form they're going to do that.
Yes, no, I agree. I will tell for the audience that I am age 52, and the current estimates for the depletion of the Social Security OASI trust fund is in 2032, 2033, which means basically 10 years from now, when I turn 62, the trust funds may be depleted, and I'll have to make that decision if Congress does nothing before that. And I think it's important, and you know, Jeff, you mentioned it, so I'll just make it quick before I turn it back over to the panelists for questions, that Social Security is not going bankrupt. Like we hear that too often, right? It's not going bankrupt. If the trust funds are depleted, Congress does nothing, and the estimates are it could pay out 77% of benefits. So there'll still be something there, but it's important still to plan accordingly and talk about how we need to augment our current retirement system with more protected income on top of Social Security, regardless. Anna, let me ask you, how do you think, like, we're thinking about the behavioral challenges. There's behavioral challenges for like participants. How can employers help?
Yes, very much so. First of all, I want to tell you statistics that we got from the PFIN index, which is that when we ask people how many hours per week did they spend about thinking about their personal finance issues, they say that 8 hours are spent on average. And of those 8 hours, 4 are at work. Okay, so I actually think that the employer has not just an incentive, but probably a benefit by offering employees tools, help in planning for retirement, and I think in planning also for their financial decisions. And I think there are actually several examples of successful programs, and there are also several companies and institutions devoted to workplace financial education. And in my view, if I had to make something, since we are so much into the mandatory part, I actually think since we have changed the system, potentially it would be helpful to make mandatory also some financial education in the workplace. And believe it or not, even though I am an economist, I've written a paper together with a law scholar about that.
Economists and lawyers working together, it's like cats and dogs playing in the park. Ken, what do you think employers can do more to help employees? And I'm going to ask Nick that same question next.
There's a lot that employers need to do, and people get their retirement plan in the United States through employer-sponsored retirement savings plans. And the fundamental problem with lifetime income is when the problems manifest themselves as people are going through retirement and they're trying to figure out how not to run out of money. They are no longer employed because they're retired. And so under the current system, employers' incentives are all wrong. Their fiduciary responsibilities focus them just on accumulation, and they kind of have an incentive to not focus on the lifetime income because the employers are then no longer their problem, if you will. And so having the laws and regulations changed so that the fiduciary responsibility of employers is defined where they must consider retirement income and they must help their employees to solve this problem will align the incentives of both employer and employee. And then they can put a default retirement income solution in place along with tools and education. Just very briefly, Anna Maria talked about how it's so important that people have better financial and risk literacy so that they can solve the retirement income problem. Right now, I think it's not a question of them not putting the time into it. It's that they're terrified. People are fearful, anxious, and depressed when it comes to solving this, attempting to solve this problem. And I think they're also assuming that there actually is no solution to the problem. And that's not the case. So by having real tools in education, having default options, having a full court press on employees through the employer, I think people can move into a much better place emotionally when it comes to engaging with this issue.
Nick, I'd ask you to also add your thoughts on this, and also when you think about how this actually is impactful, how it impacts people, like the younger generation who seems to have more jobs than like our parents have. They've had one job for life. We now have people who have 7, 8 jobs over the course of their life, if not more. How does this change the planning process, how employers should help employees?
Okay, there's two parts of this. If I just think about the call it the job changes that younger employees are having, what we find is that older employees who are more worried about with longevity and retirement, they tend to have fewer jobs, or they've maintained the same amount of jobs that we've seen in previous generations. So once you're at about 45 years old, you're only going to have 1 or 2 firms left at about 45 years old. You tend to see the churn for younger employees. When we think about longevity and we think about annuities and guaranteed income, it's really for those older workers. And I would counter some of the other comments here, right? I do think the defaults work. And I think we can only look at what employers have done in the last 15-ish years, a little longer than that, since the Pension Protection Act. People with access to corporate 401k plans are doing very well relative to the rest of the population and relative to previous generations with and without DB plans. So savings rates are up, the wealth accumulation is up because we've done these auto features. If I think of the work that Richard Thaler did, which won him a Nobel Prize, he got people to be nudged into these decisions. And I think we have to take that same framework and be able to embed institutional quality annuities into these target date funds. It's what we've talked about at BlackRock now for about 5 years. Jason, it's where you and I have worked together on some pieces, because we don't ask an individual in a target date fund what percent of the portfolio should be in non-US stocks or what percent of the portfolio should be in inflation protected bonds. The idea we're going to educate somebody on the difference between a QLAC, a RILA, a DIA, a FIA, a SPIA, it's an alphabet soup for people. What we've been able to design in the last 15 years are professionally managed, diversified, low-cost solutions. And while these are not the perfect solution, we're not aiming for perfect here. We're aiming to help people in retirement to live a more stable retirement. One point that I have to make when I talk to plan sponsors is the majority of the people in the plan are not going to have access to a financial advisor. They are the financial advisor. So what can a plan do? It is exactly what Ken said earlier. They have to take a very real look at how are their people going to spend in retirement. One of my favorite lines I've ever heard from a plan sponsor is if somebody has worked for that company for 25 years and then get to retirement and they can't live a stable retirement, he viewed it as a failure of his own plan.
Jeff, you've noticed, you've talked a lot about behavioral biases, and you've mentioned to me in the past before that employers have biases too. God, employers are people as well, but what do you mean in this context, and how is that important for us to?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, look, these behavioral biases that make annuitization complex and difficult to understand, make it hard to value and so forth, these are sort of innate human characteristics that, unless you've had a lot of training and thinking about uncertainty and risk trade-offs over time and so forth, it's hard to get your head wrapped around. And most employers, especially smaller employers that don't have a large, HR shop that specializes in this stuff, they suffer these same behavioral biases. And so we have to, employers do play a really important role in this process, but we have to recognize that they're going to need education as well in order to be able to effectively educate their participants. And I just think that's worth noting here.
It's a good point. Sort of a rapid fire wrap up before I close things. I guess I'd ask one thing. What would you like to see change in this environmental landscape for retirement income security to help better align incentives, either with employers and employees or employees with protected income strategies? What's the one thing you would change? I'll go Nick, Anna, Ken, and then Jeff. Nick, you get to go first. Rapid fire.
Oh man, one thing, there's so many things I would change. I wouldn't say it's a legal constraint. I might even steal Ken's on this one, where I would like to see more of a focus on what happens post-employment.
Anna?
I would like to see more financial education starting as early as possible, in fact, in college. And this is also what we are doing here at Stanford. So, we want to take action right away.
Excellent. Ken?
Make evaluating retirement income a specific fiduciary duty of employers. So change the definition of the fiduciary duty.
That's a good one. Jeff?
That was actually mine as well. As the fiduciary burden on not providing income options should be at least as high as on providing them. We have it completely reversed today.
I appreciate it. So I want to thank everybody, Nick, Anna, Ken, Jeff, for all of your advice and expertise today in joining us. I also want to thank Letty for the introductions and all the team here at BPC for making this happen. For the viewers, there's a lot of resources available on these issues. The Bipartisan Policy Center, Nick mentioned we did a joint paper, he and I, so BlackRock and BPC, on protected income, how to optimize it. That's available on the Bipartisan Policy Center website, so it's bipartisanpolicy.org. Jeff's got a lot of research, and Anna, you just Google their names and you're going to get their whole CV, and they've got so much out there, and Ken's got work he's doing as well. There's also the Alliance for Lifetime Income Retirement Income Institute. That's protectedincome.org. A lot of research papers in there on how to optimize and think about annuities and protected income strategies. And of course, Funding Our Future, which sponsored this, is fundingourfuture.us. Has all of our partners and their information, resources, and research, as well as on the web. And it's all available at no charge. It's open, it's public, because we really feel and care about this issue. And if not now, when? Again, 12,000 people a day are going to start turning 65. This is a retirement income challenge we have, and it's something we need to solve today. So I want to thank everyone again for their time and really appreciate it. Thank you.